Likutei Sichos Chelik Beis, volume 22, the first Sicha of Parshas Behar. This Sicha will explain and highlight how in every single mitzvah there is the optimal and the suboptimal manner of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, of that particular mitzvah, yet both the optimal and the suboptimal are inherently the mitzvah. That means they're inherently from the fabric of the mitzvah. To better flow through the Sicha, let's familiarize ourselves with the terms lechatchila versus b'diavad. And we're going to use those terms. Lechatchila means literally translated, to begin with. B'diavad, literally translated, is after the event, after the fact. Common example, many times in Shulchan Aruch, it'll tell us that a mitzvah has to be in performed, has to be fulfilled in such a manner. But then it says, however, if one did it this way, meaning after the fact, once it's been done this way, well, one has also fulfilled their obligation. That is the literal and absolute meaning in terms of halachic application of lechatchila versus b'diavad. However, on a deeper level, it's also, as the Rebbe will explain in depth in this Sicha, lechatchila versus b'diavad means that even in the mitzvah itself, even in the full and most complete performance of the mitzvah, there still is an aspect of b'diavad versus an aspect of lechatchila, as we'll see in the Sicha. Another term to familiarize ourselves with, an eved ivri, literally translated a Jewish slave. And that is, as it appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 2, if one gets sold as a slave, it says, quote, he should work for 7 years. He has to serve, meaning his term of enslavement is 6 years. Uvashvis, and in the 7th year, he goes out free. That's his year of freedom. Another term to familiarize ourselves with, another concept, tzedokim and baisusim. There was a group that broke away from traditional Judaism, and their leader of the group, his name was Tzadok, thus the name Tzedokim. Another group was very similar to them in ideology. It was Baisus, and thus the Baisusim. And one of their main arguments, their main beef, so to speak, with Judaism is that they denied the validity, the truth of Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law as we know it, as it interprets many, if not all, of the mitzvahs that appear in the Torah, that they can't be taken literally. One common example which applies to this Sicha, which is also very applicable and apropos to where we're now in the calendar, and that is the counting of the Omer. The Torah says, "Usvartem lachem imachras haShabbos." You should begin to count from the next day, the tomorrow, that is literally, of the Shabbos. Now, of course, the meaning over there is that you're supposed, as Torah Shebaal Peh explains, that you're supposed to start counting the 49 days, culminating with the 50th day when you celebrate Shavuos, on the next day after the first day of Pesach, after the celebration of Pesach, which is also called Shabbos. Not typically called Shabbos, but it's also called Shabbos. They, however, denied this interpretation. And they said, no, you begin to count always on a Sunday. And thus, Shavuos always falls out on a Sunday, according to their way of thinking. One more thing, the way we have our calendar set today is very confirmed, very precise. One could know in advance, many years in advance, if one only knows how to do the calculation, how to follow the formula, one could know when Shavuos will be, when Pesach will be, and so on. However, in the ideal counting of the calendar, deciding of the calendar that is, namely in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, the way it was done was by Kiddush HaChodesh, the way the Torah sets down the rules that witnesses would come, they would appear and give testimony that they have seen the new moon, and then once the Beis Din ascertained that indeed that is the case, Beis Din would then in real time announce the Rosh Chodesh. Thus, it could possibly be that after counting 49 days and celebrating the 50th day of Shavuos, that it didn't necessarily always coincide with the 6th of Sivan as it does now, because now we have a preset calendar. Let's go into the Sicha. In our Parsha, chapter 25, Verse 2, it says, V'shafsa ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem, that on the 7th year, the earth, the land, should rest, a resting for Hashem, a Shabbos for Hashem. That the earth has to rest. You're not allowed to do any work with the ground, and so on and so forth. The Zohar, which is the esoteric secrets of the Torah, comments on this and says, it actually introduces the verse from the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, the verse that speaks about the releasing of the Jewish slave on the 7th year. That means he has to work a full 6 years, and on the 7th year he goes free. And here's what the Zohar says, that every single Jewish person also has a rest on Shemitah. And with that rest of the earth, it also makes a requirement for the rest, for the freedom of work for the slaves. So this basically implies that the rest of the earth is inherently connected to the rest of the slave after his 6-year term. Now, it would seem that what the Zohar is saying is that there's a direct connection. And just like on the 7th year you have to give the earth a rest, on the 7th year, on the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, you would have to give the servant, the Eved Ivri, a rest. But the fact is that that's not the case. The halacha is, and we don't find anywhere that the Zohar should be arguing with the halacha, that the Eved Ivri, irrespective of when Shemitah falls out, when the real sabbatical year falls out, the Eved Ivri needs to serve a full term of 6 years, even if it overlaps Shemitah. In other words, it has to be a full 6 years from when he was sold as a slave, and then on his 7th year, he gets released. So the question is, what does the Zohar mean? What exactly is the idea of what the Zohar, the correlation that the Zohar is making between the sabbatical year, the 7th year, and the 7th year of that individual who's been sold as a slave? So the Rebbe says, in order to understand this, we'll first introduce a very interesting concept, very interesting fact, which we find in many mitzvahs, and the Rebbe is going to go about bringing a number of examples from very, very interestingly, from various types of mitzvahs. We find in a mitzvah, every single mitzvah almost, that it has the aspect of lechatchila and the aspect of b'diavad. Now, like I explained in the introduction, you have it in the literal sense, that this is the ideal, the optimal manner in which the mitzvah needs to be performed. But then there is the after the fact, b'diavad, if it wasn't done exactly that way, as long as you met a certain criteria, a certain threshold, okay, you fulfilled the mitzvah. However, it's brought in the Achreinim, in many of the sources, that this difference between lechatchila and b'diavad goes to the deepest, the most fundamental, and actual core of the mitzvah. That means every single mitzvah has both the aspect of lechatchila in it and the aspect of b'diavad. Here are several examples. Let's take first the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. As I already mentioned in the introduction, if you look in Parshas Emor, chapter 23, verse 15, it says, Usfartem lochem imachras haShabbos. You should begin counting the next day of Shabbos. Now, of course, we know, according to Torah Sheba'al Peh, what does this mean? The next day of Pesach, the second day of Pesach. But then the question becomes, why then did the Torah say the next day of Shabbos when it means the next day of Pesach? And in fact, this is really the cause, this is the root of all the problems. This is what gives room to the argument of the Tzdoikim and the Baisusim. However, based on what we said, that every mitzvah has a lechatchila and b'diavad component, that means there's the aspect of lechatchila in the mitzvah and then there's the aspect of the Eved, we can better understand it. We'll appreciate the fact that regardless of when Pesach falls out, regardless of when the first day of Pesach is, when one begins counting Sfira on the next day and counts it for 49 days, they have fulfilled the mitzvah, the will of Hashem in its entirety. 100%. However, in a year when Hashem makes it so that the actual first day of Pesach falls out on Shabbos, that means Friday night is the first Seder, and Motzoi Shabbos and Saturday night we begin counting the Omer, then not only do we have the mitzvah in its entirety. We're doing the full mitzvah as Hashem wants us to do it, but we also have it in the optimal manner, in the lechatchila manner, which is that we have it literally mimachar Shabbos. Another example. We know when the Beis HaMikdash stood, in order for one to really and fully fulfill the obligation of celebrating Yom Tov, if they were able-bodied and they owned land, for example, so they had the actual requirement, they had an obligation to do the Aliyah L'Regel, the pilgrimage. And that included bringing certain offerings, certain korbanos. Without that, they would have not have fulfilled the Yom Tov. Nowadays, however, we do not have a Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, we don't have the obligation of Aliyah L'Regel, nor could we do the obligation of bringing the sacrifices that go along with it. And yet, our fulfillment, our observance of Yom Tov is 100%. So you see again, within the mitzvah of Yom Tov, there is the 100% of Yom Tov, but then there's the 100%, which in the most ideal manner is also lechatchila, on the most optimal level possible. Moreover, if we're talking about Yom Tov, within Yom Tov itself, meaning within the Yom Tov of Pesach or Sukkot, where you have 7 days and 7 days, within the Yom Tov, within the period of 7 days that the Torah calls it Yom Tov, you also have a difference between the Yom Tov, the actual Chag, and the Chol HaMoed. The Chag, you're not allowed to do any malacha. Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to do certain malachas. But yet, it has the same name, and to a great extent, the same holiness as the day of Yom Tov, or the days of Yom Tov, in which you're not allowed to do any malacha. You're not allowed to perform any tasks. Good example for that. There is no less of a prohibition of eating chametz on the first day of Pesach versus the second day of Chol HaMoed. They're both equally Pesach. But yet on this one, it's Yom Tov, it's Chag, similar to Shabbos, and this is more similar to weekdays. So you see again within Yom Tov itself a component of lechatchila and b'di'evet. And now we can get a better appreciation going back to the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. Remember, we asked the question, how come the Torah says, Usfarta lachem memachras HaShabbos, you should begin counting in the next day of Shabbos, when really what it means is the next day of Pesach? What the Torah is telling us is that one needs to begin counting the next day of Pesach, and that is the entirety of the mitzvah. That is 100% the mitzvah. However, when it happens, like we said before, when it happens that it falls out on a Shabbos, thus the beginning of the count is not only the next day of Pesach, but also literally Mimacharas HaShabbos, then you have it in the most supreme and optimal, ideal manner that there possibly could be. Now, it's understood that this is not in any way holding back from the shleimus of the mitzvah. Like we said, when it doesn't fall out that way, you're not missing an iota of the mitzvah. But yet, when it does happen so, this is the most lechatchila. In light of the above, says the Rebbe, we can attempt to understand a seemingly odd statement that the Gemara makes in Maseches Rosh Hashanah in regards to the end of the counting of the Sfira. Remember, after you finish counting 49 days, on the 50th day, we celebrate Shavuos. Now, essentially, what is Shavuos all about? We're celebrating the anniversary of our receiving the Torah on Har Sinai. But yet, the Gemara makes a statement in Maseches Rosh Hashanah which says that Atzeres, which means Shavuos, sometimes it can fall out on the 5th, sometimes it can fall out on the 6th, and sometimes it falls out on the 7th of Sivan. Again, this is in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when they established Rosh Chodesh, not based on a pre-calculated formula, but rather according to the real-time vision of the new moon and establishment of Rosh Chodesh by the Beis Din, then it was possible that some of the months had 29 days, 30 days. There was no way of predicting, and that's why, and therefore, Shavuos, which is the 50th day, where the Torah connects it and stipulates it to being the 50th day from when you began counting the Omer, could sometimes be either on the 5th of Sivan, sometimes a little later on the 7th of Sivan, or sometimes on the actual anniversary of Shavuos. Now think about it. As we said, what is the celebration of Shavuos? It's because they count 49 days, similar to what our ancestors did after they left Mitzrayim, and having this great anticipation and yearning for the giving of the Torah, which came about after they finished counting the 49 days on the 50th day. So how could it be that sometimes you celebrate the 50th day, Shavuos, which is really a commemoration, anniversary of the giving of the Torah, but not on the actual anniversary, not on the 6th of Sivan. And not only that, the celebration of Shavuos is inherently connected to the Torah, to the giving of the Torah, so much so that when you look at the list of the korbanos, all the offerings of the various Yom Tovim, for each Yom Tov there's also an offering which is called a chatos, usir izim lechatos, that you have to bring a young goat as a sin offering. However, by Shavuos there's no sin offering. And the Chazal ask why, and they explain. Because Hashem says, quote, since you were willing and you were ready to accept upon yourself the yoke of Torah, I consider it for you as if you never sinned. In other words, there's no aspect of sin associated with Shavuos, and that shows us how inherent this is connected to the Torah. But yet, it's possible that we celebrate it not on the actual anniversary of the giving of the Torah. But of course, based on what we said above, the explanation is as follows. Since the whole idea of Sfiras HaOmer is inherently as a preparation for Matan Torah, like our ancestors did, therefore the 50th day is connected to Matan Torah. However, when it falls out on the 6th of Sivan, as it does now in our calendar, when it falls out on the 6th of Sivan, then you have an alignment of the optimal idea. You have both the 50th day, which is inherently connected to Shavuos, and now you have it also fall out on the 6th day, which is the actual calendar date, the anniversary of when Hashem gave it. And we have yet another example in another very important and fundamental mitzvah in Judaism. And that is the mitzvah of Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, remembering the exodus from Egypt, which we know that it's so important, so fundamental that we have to remember it every single day. But yet, there's two varying components to this mitzvah, or we should say two tiers in this mitzvah. You have the night of Pesach, as we do by the Haggadah, when we sit by the Seder. There's an actual obligation and a very detailed, a very elaborate obligation in remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Mitzrayim. It's very specific, it's very elaborate, and you have to actually discuss it and go about it on and on and on, and do various symbolic activities in order to demonstrate the joy of leaving Mitzrayim and show how much we remember the exodus of Mitzrayim. And yet, on the other hand, there is the mitzvah throughout the entire year, which compared to the obligation, the detailed obligation of the night of Pesach, is very void of any detail whatsoever. Okay, it's very superficial, if I may. But at the end of the day, they're both the same mitzvah, remembering the leaving of Mitzrayim, remembering the exodus from Egypt. Yet, here you have, so to speak, a lechatchila aspect of it. Here you have, throughout the entire year, what we can call the b'di'evet aspect of it. Another example of this, in the Mishnah in Shkolim, in Tractate Shkolim, right in the beginning of chapter 5, the Mishnah enumerates the various tasks on which there were appointees in the Beis HaMikdash. There's various functions. The person who was in charge of the priestly garments, the person who was in charge of the various offerings, of the various libations, and so on. And the Mishnah gives each one a name. Literally, not a name of a title, but rather a name. Yochanan ben this and this person. And of course, all the commentaries discuss it. What does this mean? It cannot be that throughout all generations, they always found an appointee. They always found a person to be in charge of that function with the exact same name of his predecessor. It's just impossible. So the explanation is that the original appointees went by that name. But here comes the question. We know that the Mishnah is not a book of history, and not just telling us, some FYIs. Certainly not things that happened in the past. Of what halachic value is it? So thus come many of the commentaries and explain That what it's telling us is that all the people who succeeded the original ones, they're all successors of the original appointees on those tasks, they all were given like a moniker, they were all given the name of the original appointee to that task. What does that tell us? We know that a name brings out a character of someone. A name brings out the essence of the person. So that tells us that the original appointee had a very specific, elated character. And those character traits were reflected in his name. And that is the reason why he was chosen for that to lead that particular area of service in the Beis HaMikdash, to be the appointee for that task. All his successors certainly had good character, certainly also had great abilities, and were able to somewhat fill the shoes of the original appointee, but not necessarily were they on the same level, the same character. Because the fact is they weren't, quote, born with that name, but yet they were given that name. So once again, you see, says the Rebbe, an aspect of lechatchila versus b'di'evet. Both of them were great appointees. All of them definitely served their tasks, their purpose, and did their duties, and to the fullest extent. But yet, this was the original. This is later, so to speak, a duplicate, a replica, not the actual original, ideal or optimal. According to all of this, all these examples that we brought thus far, says that Rebbe will get a better appreciation of the Zohar. Yes, there is the 7th year of Klal Yisrael that belongs to the Klal. And that's the 7th year that the earth has to rest. Then there's the 7th year of the individual. That is somebody that maybe has been sold as a slave, as an Eved Ivri. Both of them have the aspect of 7. That means that there is a common point, there is a commonality, there's a connection between the two. The difference is that when it comes to the 7th year, which is like the lechatchila, the optimal, this is one that belongs to all, it belongs to the klal. There, it's Shabbos LaHashem. It's the ultimate rest. It's the ultimate Shabbos. And therefore, everything rests. The earth, the Jew, everything. It's an inherent rest for all. When it comes to the individual, this idea of 7 is certainly also there, but not in its full shlemus. Because the Eved Ivri is part of Klal Yisrael, that's what the Zohar is saying. That just like, quote unquote, just like there is a rest for the earth, there's that great Klal rest, so too there's a rest for him in his 7th year. When they become aligned, meaning when the 7th year of this individual happens to fall out on a Shemitah year, that means he was sold literally in the beginning of the 6-year cycle leading up to Shemitah, now then you have it all come together in its optimal form, in its great optimum state that can possibly be.